and then the worms lay eggs so that when we take the Scotch tape off overnight, we can look at it under a microscope and say, ooh, look, worm eggs, they're there, it's positive, and we can treat it.
Our doctors and healthcare professionals are one of the most crucial elements of our society, but boy do they see a lot. From a bump on a girl's tongue that stumped 5 separate doctors, to a Scottish man's sunbathing day turned horribly wrong. On today's list, I'll be covering a few more disturbing things that doctors have seen. Starting off this list at number 10. This story starts off with a man who has had quite a few too many alcoholic beverages walking into the emergency department. This usually is not a great combination for the start of a story, and this one is no different. After waiting in the waiting room for a while, he eventually gets taken into a room to see the doctor. When the doctor asks him what's wrong, the man explains that he can't get his contacts out. He said that he was trying to pull them out of his eyes, but he just couldn't get them out, and it was starting to be painful for him. The doctor goes to examine his eyes and to see if he can figure out what's going on. When the doctor looks at the man's eyes, he realizes that most likely because of the alcohol, this man doesn't realize that he must have already taken them out, and that he has actually been pulling on his eye and not his contacts. The man ended up having a partial tear in his cornea, and I am so glad that it wasn't worse because this story really gives me a shiver down my spine. Moving on to number 9. Motorcycle crashes are pretty notorious for having some gruesome scenes, and this one definitely was no different. A man was brought into the ER after being involved in a crash when he was driving his motorcycle, and he had a severe foot and leg injury. The doctor didn't know exactly how bad, but once he gets there, the doctor goes to examine the damage and decide what the next course of action should be. As he's examining the foot, he realizes that it is barely hanging on by a thread. It was so bad, he described it like a mozzarella stick that had been pulled apart. The doctor, of course, realizes how serious this situation is and of course gets this man into the operating room as fast as possible. Luckily, the doctor was actually able to save this man's foot and completely reattach it, which is amazing news. Moving on to number 8. This one is a pretty short story as this doctor didn't include a lot of detail, but it sure is disgusting. This doctor went to see a patient who apparently had an ingrown toenail, which honestly seems pretty painful. When the doctor gets there, he realizes that this ingrown toenail is actually just a toenail that is barely hanging on at all, and that the best solution at this point really would just be to remove it entirely. The doctor gets the toe frozen and pulls the nail off, but what he reveals underneath is what he never expected. There were actual maggots living under this toenail, and apparently not just a few. This definitely shocked the doctor as it was the last thing he was expecting to see, so it's no wonder this experience really stuck with him. Moving on to number 7. This story is told from the patient, but definitely shocked the doctors who were there that day. A 10-year-old girl noticed a bump on her tongue one day, but didn't think too much of it. The next day, however, the bump had really grown and it was freaking her out, so she told her mom, which is the right thing to do. Her mom took her to the emergency room where they waited for a long time because that's what you do at the emergency room before they were finally taken into a room to see the doctor. The doctor comes and the girl is waiting to hear why she has a bump on her tongue when the doctor says, "I've never seen this before." Her mom is in the corner crying out of worry, and this 10-year-old girl thinks doctors know everything, so she's obviously freaked out that he doesn't know what's going on. 5 more doctors and the chief of staff came to take a look at this bump, and they decided that the best course of action was to poke it. They applied a local anesthetic so that it wouldn't hurt, but she could feel the pressure as they poked around. The doctor then asked, "When was the last time you ate popcorn?" The 10-year-old replied a few days ago, as she could clearly remember since she was trying not to chew it loudly while she was watching the X-Files Sewer Monster episode. As it turns out, a popcorn kernel had suctioned itself to her tongue, and since the tissue on your tongue regenerates so quickly, the kernel was basically just absorbed into her tongue, which is what was giving it a bump. Definitely a pretty crazy story that I am glad had such a simple solution and ending. Moving on to number 6. This story comes from the Reddit user Cow and is a story they got from their neighbor. This neighbor was working in the ER one day and described it as one of those days that is just bloody. She explained that there was an unbelievable amount of really bad nosebleeds that day for some reason, and she was constantly dealing with people who were getting woozy from their nosebleeds. A guy walks into the ER, and as she turns around, she sees him holding a bloody rag to his face. She's thinking to herself, really? Another nosebleed? She asks the man to lower the rag so that she can see how bad it is, and he listens. When he lowers the rag though, she sees that his jaw literally drops, like almost completely off of his face except for a few tendrils of skin that were holding it on. She calmly asks the man to put his rag back on his face, which he does, and then she quickly escorted him to the trauma center so that he could get the help that he needed. I do not know how our healthcare professionals stay so calm in these kinds of situations because I would absolutely panic. Moving on to number 5. This is a story that comes from a studying doctor's professor, and it takes place in rural Alabama. A couple came into the emergency room after they had been quite intoxicated and ended up getting in a huge argument. During the argument, the woman in this couple accidentally fell off of their porch and into some shrubs. Of course, the argument immediately stopped and the man rushed over to see if she was okay. She was basically fine aside from a few scratches, but he noticed that it seemed like during her fall, something had gotten stuck in her arm. Since they had that liquid courage, plus I'm sure the worry about the cost of medical care, the man decided to get some pliers and just remove the object himself. He clamped down and pulled as hard as he could, but it just absolutely would not budge. He eventually gave up and they headed to the emergency room where the professor was working. He examines the woman and he very quickly realizes that she had a compound fracture of her humerus, and what the man was trying to pull out of her arm was actually her bone. I hate that one. Moving on to number 4. This story comes from Lado Telly on Reddit and is a story from when their mom was earlier on in her medical training. A man came into the ER with some foot issues, so she began to do a foot exam. Upon first examination, his feet were extremely gangrenous, which is usually what happens to a limb when the tissue starts to decay as there's insufficient blood flow. She quickly knew that there was a slew of issues she was about to need to take care of on his feet and decided that the best first step would be to soak his feet before dressing them. She prepared a basin of warm water and placed his feet in there to soak, and while they are soaking, she heads off to get some other work done. About 30 minutes later, she returns to the room since the feet have probably soaked for long enough. As she goes to remove his feet from the water, she realizes that all 10 of his toes had come off in the water and were floating. So gross. This story is another one from Lado Telly on Reddit, as both of his parents were doctors. So this one comes from his father and is based in Scotland in the early 90s. Apparently it was a very sunny day for Scotland and one of the only days you would actually be able to get a tan. One Scottish man got a little too excited about the nice weather, and rather than getting slathered in sunscreen, he grabbed some sheets of tinfoil and covered himself in cooking oil. This is definitely not what anyone should do at any point, but unfortunately this man maybe didn't know any better. A few hours later, he had to be picked up in an ambulance and taken to the emergency department, which is where Lado Telly's doctor dad comes in. This man had burned himself so badly in the sun that he had third-degree burns all over his body. Moving on to number 2. This story comes from Sideshow87 on Reddit as they're explaining one of their father's stories, as he was an emergency room doctor for 20 years. Just to make the story more clear, this user refers to his father as Dr. J. A patient came into the ER one night holding his stomach, and the front of his jacket was bloody. Dr. J could tell that he was really out of it, and he also seemed to be under the influence. Dr. J asked what was going on and if he could explain the issue, and the patient responded that his stomach was hurting him. Dr. J says, "Let's take a look," and goes to pull the guy's jacket and arms back so that he can examine the stomach when things take quite a turn. As the guy pulls his arms away, his intestines literally start to spill out on the floor, which really explains why his stomach was hurting so bad. The patient apparently very matter-of-factly explained how he sustained these injuries and how he realized he probably needed to go to the hospital. I'm sure this was definitely one of the more shocking days on the job for Dr. J. Moving on to number 1. This story comes from someone who's recounting their dad's story, as he is a doctor who we'll call Dr. K. Dr. K was off duty one day and went to pick up some pizzas for his family. As he was just turning onto the street the pizza place was on, he heard a very loud crashing sound. He turned around and realized that a motorcycle had just slammed into the side of an SUV. His face ended up taking a lot of the impact, so his helmet flew all the way off of his head and about 30 feet into the air. Dr. K rushed over to help and saw that this man was in very bad shape and was struggling to breathe, but Dr. K did everything he could to clear his airway and then made sure his neck was stabilized until the ambulance arrived. The ambulance took 10 whole minutes, so it is definitely a very good thing that Dr. K was there while they waited. Once the ambulance got there, Dr. K told them what he knew, and off they went. It turns out this man ended up suffering multiple fractures in a couple different vertebrae, an almost non-existent jaw, and other facial fractures, broken collarbones, broken ribs, collapsed lung, amongst a slew of other things. Flash forward 1 full year and Dr. K is working in the emergency room where he has worked for the last 20 years, and he gets a page to come to the main lobby of the hospital. When he gets to the lobby, he sees a man standing there that looks kind of familiar, but he doesn't really know him. This man comes up to Dr. K and wraps him up in a great big bear hug and starts crying. That is when Dr. K realizes who this man is and of course starts crying as well. The man just keeps repeating, "Thank you, you saved my life." They chatted for a while about the recovery process and how his physiotherapy was going. Apparently Dr. K has said it was one of the best experiences of his life. Oh, that was so nice. I just liked the ending of that one, which is why I had to put it at number 1, because it just really leaves you with that warm, fuzzy feeling. That has been our list for today, guys. Thank you so much for checking it out. I've been your host, Olivia Kozlowski, and I'll see you next time. Bye! How many times did I just say room in that sentence? Place in rural Alabama. And did I just say Alabama? I don't even know if I did.